Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I welcome back Bartlett Cleland, PRI's Senior Fellow in Tech and Innovation. Bartlett talks about all things tech, including trade negotiations with China on intellectual property, the current state of our privacy laws, the debate over the possible breakup of social media companies, internet taxation, and the gig economy and the impact of regulation on the jobs being created. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Next Round, Bartlett.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with one of the issues that's been popping up in the presidential campaign trail lately. Are tech giants like Google too big, and do they control too much? Presidential candidates like Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden have said they'd be okay with breaking up social media giants. So what's your view? Should we be moving to break up big tech companies like Facebook? And what would that mean for consumers if they were broken up?
The very short answer, I think, is no. But let me explain how I get there. One thing that has always attracted me to tech policy is that on almost every issue, you kind of have to start from scratch. Things are different. That doesn't mean that tech is principally different. The principles are still the same, but how you get to your principles and how they apply in a technological landscape, I do think change some of the outcomes. So in a world of 100 years ago, maybe antitrust was a great tool. I don't think it was necessarily, but I have significant doubts about whether antitrust, assuming that's what they're talking about in breaking up tech giants, and I think that is fair. I'm not sure it has a huge role in technology, and there are all kinds of economic reasons for this, but to cut to the chase is that the effect that we see on consumers of technology, let's just call it consolidating, tend to be positive for the consumer. And we've historically taken a consumer-centric view of antitrust, or what they call in Europe competition policy. But in Europe, they call it competition policy because it is about competition, not about the consumer. To me, it's hard to make an economic case when consumers are getting more for less, that there's a problem in the marketplace. And I think that's largely the case where these technology companies are concerned.
At the national level, we're seeing that trade is the dominant issue in the headlines these days. And we're seeing lately that the world's markets are holding their breaths as President Trump tries to negotiate a trade deal with President Xi Jinping of China. So you've argued that one of the most important issues that the president must deal with in any trade issue with China is protecting American intellectual property. How so? And what advice would you give to President Trump in his negotiations to protect our patents and intellectual property? And what do you think are the prospects of being able to achieve a trade deal with China that protects our intellectual property and American innovation?
Really good questions, and frankly, I think not a lot of easy answers. If you take a look at the accomplishments in China, largely brought about by external pressure from the U.S. and others, China has fairly good intellectual property laws on the books. They don't enforce them, but they have them on the books. So really, the trade angle has to be more about enforcement. And ultimately, I don't know that I have a silver bullet answer for how one pressures China to enforce those rules. There's interesting piece that goes along with this. I could split a hair. It ultimately ends up putting us in the same place. But sometimes China doesn't exactly steal, quote unquote, intellectual property. Not like we would have thought about the Russians stealing it 10, 15 years ago. In China, they have two different laws that work together that are really dangerous, I think, for American innovation. And number one is that if you set up a company in China, so imagine you're doing business here and you want to have a Chinese location, they do require you to then be, by their definitions, when you're headquartered there, if you have so much sales, et cetera. For you to organize that company in China, it must be 51% owned by a Chinese national. The second law is that a Chinese national can literally be put in prison if the government asks the CEO or someone in authority in a business to do something, perform something, to give something, et cetera. If they don't comply with that, they can go to prison. Tie those together, and what you have is, if you have a company, and famously years ago, Cisco was in this case, where they set up a Chinese part of their company, and then you have, now it's owned by China, 51% by a Chinese national, then you have the government come in and pressure them to give up some of their intellectual property. It's not exactly stealing because it's 51% owned by the Chinese national, but effectively we end up in the same place. So I think there are probably two operating factors here. It's kind of that combination of laws, but then secondly, it's really about enforcement and making sure our IP is protected wherever it is around the world.
So, we're still trying to get our heads around the next next generation of cars, which will be self-driving or automated cars. While they're still in the testing phase, they've got the potential to change driving as we know it as soon as even a decade from now. You've written about an outdated federal government policy still on the books related to Wi-Fi that is holding up the development of automated cars. What's the problem here, and what policy changes should the federal government make to catch up with the driverless car innovation?
So this one, in many ways, sounds complicated, but turns out being really easy. So there's a band of spectrum. Think of spectrum as a rainbow, and each color maybe is a different channel. And one of those channels is called 5.9. It's about a frequency rating, like you tune your radio. But in that frequency, that 5.9 has been set aside in the 90s for the development of government-created technology around automated vehicles. Many people would not be surprised to learn that 27 years later, we still don't have that system working. Still don't have a government, as it were, automated vehicle. And why is that? Well, they gambled, as it were, in one area, and that was that automated vehicles would necessarily be tied to a Wi-Fi system. But if you've ever traveled, particularly through mountains, come to mind, you'll find that sometimes your cell service isn't awesome, and that really doesn't work out when it's your car that's operating, particularly when it's at safety measures. So what manufacturers have done over the years, and this is what we see being tested a lot in California, a combination of radar, what's called LiDAR, and other technologies, so that the car, instead of operating as part of a giant system, operates as an independent vehicle and is aware of other things around it. Hence, you hear sometimes negative stories about cars running into things. That's because it's not all part of a hive mind, as it were, all on a Wi-Fi system. So, long story short, then, is government still has this piece of spectrum set aside. Technologies haven't been developed to the point where they can be deployed. If they were to be deployed, every other vehicle on the road would have to have the technology in as well. I think the cars turn over something like 8 years or something like that per person. So it would take years and years to ever be an effective and usable system. The better use of that Wi-Fi band is, frankly, to use it for almost anything else, and certainly to use it for the coming 5G, or the now here, and the coming 5G, so that we have better, faster cellular service, Wi-Fi service, broadband service across the country.
So here in California, we're still trying to get our heads around this crazy new privacy law that the legislature rushed into passing last summer under the threat of a statewide ballot initiative from one rich guy. And you've written about this law for the Daily Caller. So now that we've had a little bit of a passage of time, what do you think consumers should be most concerned about under this new law? And lawmakers at the time said, well, we have time to enact fixes to the law. So what advice would you give them for these fixes so we have a workable framework in place that doesn't devastate the economy?
I think where state legislators need to look first is to a federal solution. And I don't say that lightly, being a person who has a strong belief in the 10th Amendment, but there really is a place and time for where interstate commerce takes place. And that online, that's writ large. You get online and you might be sitting in California, you might look at a website that's hosted in Washington, you might have your service actually going through Virginia. You're all over the place. You're not really in any one place. So almost by definition, the internet is probably the best interstate product or item I can think of. That being the case, if you pass a law that says anytime you act or interact online, here are the privacy measures, you kind of need a national scope for those laws. What will happen for consumers if we don't have a national scope is we'll end up with the California law, and Illinois has looked at a law, several other states have looked at a law. Some states have subparts of a sprawling privacy law. Maybe they have it for kids, maybe they have it for certain other people. And what happens is that, number one, as an individual, you don't know how to operate. You don't know what to expect your experience to be online. You don't know what information may or may not be known about you as you go to different places online, because those might be hosted in different states. But more than that, you probably see a reduction in what you can do online, because companies, especially small companies, startup companies, innovation companies, not going to have the money to hire the fleet of attorneys to know every privacy law across the country. And so the big guys, they probably will do just fine. They'll be able to take care of that huge regulation. Small and middle-sized companies, not so much. So I think it's twofold. One, consumers probably left without really understanding what is protected online and what's not, in a patchwork quilt of privacy laws. And number two, probably a reduction in what they will be able to do or find or buy online.
California's new governor, Gavin Newsom, can be described as a big tech guy interested in lots of tech policy. He's talked recently of creating, quote, data dividend for Californians to, quote, sharing the wealth that is created from their data. You recently wrote about this for PRI's Right by the Bay blog. So what is the governor proposing? And in your view, how would it be a good or bad thing for consumers?
So the details are a little scant. We can kind of read between the lines, perhaps, or assume how one might get to the policy that he would like. Number one, let me say, I love seeing elected officials who actually take an interest in tech policy and actually try to understand it. I think that's great. And that's nowhere we've really ever been before, maybe this generation of people who are currently being elected into office. So I think that's fantastic. But that aside, you can still blunder depending on where your principles lie and what you do online. So the idea of the data dividend, as best can be understood, is as I do things online, as I wander about online, as I create profiles online, as I list information on social media accounts, et cetera, I'm throwing off a whole lot of data that I have created. What the governor would like to see is that somehow, presumably, I would benefit from that data creation. On that, I almost completely agree with him. How fantastic is it if I could benefit when I went online, if I traded maybe my favorite color and favorite car and favorite city to visit in return for getting better service online with the kind of clothes I buy or deals for vacations, etc. Well, it turns out that's actually been happening for well over a decade online. Sometimes those deals are, a little questionable. People want to know what Disney princess they're most like or which school they would have gone to if they were Harry Potter. But ultimately, they've traded data for something they found valuable, putting aside whether I think it's valuable. They've already entered into those exchanges. The governor is suggesting that the government somehow engineer a particular price for that data and to somehow return that to somebody. And those are where the details are really scant. About the only redistribution mechanism I know that is regularly used in government is tax. And so it looks like it might be a tax. And how that would work functionally would probably be a tax on companies that use data. And then that money be used for something at the whim of a politician. I don't find that to be a good system at all for a number of reasons, as you can probably tell. But biggest one is really having the government come in and setting prices. I find that to be certainly not in the best interest of a free market for data or anything else.
You've also written extensively about another issue that's a favorite of liberal activists in California, that's net neutrality. So where we last left off, the Attorney General of California had agreed to delay implementation of California's state-only net neutrality law while a federal lawsuit moved forward. Now that we have this pause button that's been pressed, what's your recommendation to lawmakers here? Should we seize the chance to repeal this law or significantly rework it while it's temporarily on hold? And if, as is likely the case, the law continues forward, how would a California-only law impact the state's economy?
The challenge with net neutrality, I think, number one, is that we understand what anyone means by that, because various people have various interpretations. The easiest definition to me is what some principles that were set out by the FCC a while ago that companies have abided by, and in a couple instances where they didn't, were slapped down by the FTC. And so that seemed to work. What a lot of, and I think you used the word liberal activists, so I'll go ahead and take that. I think what a lot of liberal activists seem to be arguing for net neutrality is, in fact, not good rules of the road, let's say, but instead almost wholesale, if not overt wholesale control of internet service providers, for broadband providers by the government. And I find that to be completely wrongheaded for numerous reasons, not least of which is development of broadband and delivering best services in a marketplace to consumers. And I think in that, we find the answer to your last question there is what would happen in a California-only law, what would happen in the state economy. So most obviously, I would imagine some of the facilities, to the extent that they can be relocated, they would be. That's difficult, but a lot of the services would probably relocate. What would likely happen is systems in a particular state wouldn't necessarily get the same attention, they wouldn't get the same investment. And why is that? And that's because the industry couldn't get the proper return on their investment. What I suspect people understand in some broad way, but needs to be a fine point put on it, and that is that these broadband companies are investing and reinvesting in their systems constantly. And the reason that we end up every time I go to re-up my service with broadband, they say, oh, we have this new tier of speed. We have these new bells and whistles you can add on. And hey, it turns out that it's the same price or cheaper than what you were paying. The reason that happens is because of the investment and capital expenditures they're putting in. Without that, be kind of stuck with an older system. And I think that would be California's fate if it did a California-only net neutrality bill.
Bartlett, another issue you've been following closely is taxation of online purchases. You've written about last year's landmark Wayfair decision in the Supreme Court effectively opens California residents to have to pay taxes to a variety of cities and counties and special districts across the country. Incredibly complicated. What is a proper approach to online taxation? How do we strike a balance between fair tax collection and promoting entrepreneurship and innovation?
Well, that balance is always tricky, right? And I would like to think that every elected official who in some way, shape, or form is interacting with the revenue side of government is thinking about that. Sometimes we agree where they come down and sometimes we don't. But nevertheless, hopefully everyone is trying to strike that balance. But to the bigger question, this one is really easy, I think, for most people to understand because we all have a stunningly similar experience. When we get taxed, we are almost always in a physical place interacting with the physicality of that place. So what do I mean by that? You go to a shopping mall or a restaurant or a grocery store, and you go into that place, and in that place, you pay the tax, the sales tax that is due in that place. For income, same thing. If you live in the state of California, you expect to pay a California income tax. If, in fact, you're a resident of Nevada, you don't expect to pay the California income tax. Cars get taxed. You expect to pay that tax or that registration, that license fee, et-cetera, where that car is, not somewhere else. So there's a really long history in this country of a physical indicator of where a transaction is and what tax that might bring. So it's been fairly easy to understand. What Wayfair did is said that physical presence test, cleverly named, is no longer the law of the land. What now is the law of the land is what is called ephemeral tax. So you don't have to be in a particular place to signal to you that there is a tax being collected. With that, you can now imagine what can happen in multiple jurisdictions. Multiple jurisdictions could tax the same or similar transaction. They no longer have to, what's a good state? Let's pick Oregon. Oregon no longer has to be concerned about only taxing the residents of Oregon. They can reach across the state line and tax folks in California for any number of things that they could dream up because there no longer is that indication of physical or physicality for the tax. So ultimately, it probably becomes a mutually assured destruction as states start looting each other. Other states figure out ways to loot back, etc. And we kind of end up in a case like we were in the Articles of Confederation, our first gambit at running the nation, and that didn't work out so well. But that left without controls, left without guidance, that's where things likely will go to. Why haven't we seen that yet? It's been a slow start. Some states are starting to ratchet up their taxes and how they tax, and they're already budgeting. A bunch of states have already budgeted for taxes that they used to not be able to collect and now can collect. So we're headed down that road. We'll see where it goes.
Another hot tech issue in California isn't really tech related at all. It's actually a labor law issue or really more a workplace employment issue. So under the recent Dynamex ruling, many Californians who are independent contractors and enjoy being their own boss by working for small startup firms may find themselves having to be reclassified as employees rather than independent contractors. And absent a fix from the legislature, many have argued that this scheme, if you will, could put a big dent in California innovation and entrepreneurship. So what's your view?
So really, a lot related to the last issue, because typically the reason the government cares how to classify you is all about taxation and where they're going to collect their tax from, whether it's from a company or an individual. But to me, the underlying issue, and you're right, it's not necessarily a tech issue, but I think people who are interested in technology and innovation tend to be a little more open-minded about all kinds of things, I guess I would say, but particularly about freedom and liberty for the individual to kind of choose their own adventure. We remember those books and videos from years ago. That's kind of this. We now live in a world where you can choose your own adventure. If, in fact, you like going to a big corporate office building and wearing a shirt and tie and going there from 9 to 6 and doing the same thing every day, that opportunity is available to you. If you don't like that and you want to be an independent contractor, putting that in quotes, not the legal definition, of any kind of stripe, whether that's doing individual tasks, whether that's driving for Lyft or Uber part-time, whether that's, in fact, not working full-time at a company because that gives you certain freedoms you otherwise wouldn't be able to get, or, in fact, working full-time but not being part of the W-2 workforce, the tax form, but being the 1099, which is, say, independent contractor, those are all options. And what is a shame is when government starts putting its thumb on the scales to say this structure of work somehow is better than that structure of work, when in fact that should be completely up to the individual to determine.
So let's end with a question that we posed to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, which our listeners can hear in a few weeks for our special 100th episode of Next Round. So here's what we asked Leader McCarthy. Every day it seems like there is some big scandal in the tech world, from how our private data is being handled or social media companies targeting conservative voices. Many Americans are pretty concerned about big tech's role in our daily lives. It seems like some sort of sweeping congressional action is inevitable. In your view, what course should Congress chart? How can we protect people's freedoms and privacy while also encouraging innovation and the free market?
I think this one falls squarely into the category of go slow, understand what you're doing, be educated, research it, don't play politics. Data-driven policy, I think, is the right way to go here. For example, the first, how our private data is being handled. Many companies, of course, try to protect the data because for all kinds of good market reasons, but not least of which are consumer good reasons. We see over and over and over, sadly, that hackers and other bad guys come and loot the vaults, and these days the information is worth maybe more than the money directly because the data can be sold over and over. And so it's a little hard for me to wrap my head around punishing the victim in the case of someone being broken into and their intellectual property, customer list, et cetera, stolen. And then the other example on social media companies and whether they're targeting conservative voices, I don't know, this one just doesn't fire me up as much. And the reason is because there's, one, all kinds of opportunity to start whatever social media company one would like and maybe make it all conservative. But number two, I just am not that interested in government acting to control private industry. Certainly not in that kind of if we go back to the first question about breaking up companies, certainly not in that kind of heavy-handed way. So I think in the end, worth looking into, worth understanding more. It's always good that our elected officials are educated and savvy on the hot topics that people are talking about today. Absolutely no doubt about that. We have this fantastic document called the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, two documents that protect our freedoms. I think following those and understanding those are the best way to protect my freedoms. And when it comes to privacy, we talked a little bit about that. I would only add that I don't often see a place where government is going to be the best way to protect me. And I really am a constitutionalist, and I believe that, in fact, the document is designed to restrain government, and I think that's got the right balance. So understand what you're doing, follow the Constitution, and I think we'll be okay.
Thanks so much, Bartlett.
Thank you, guys.
From Bartlett, Tim, and myself, thanks for joining us. You can learn more about our work on tech by visiting PRI's website at pacificresearch.org. Also, if you're in the Bay Area, join us for a luncheon on June 14th with John Yu and Steve Hayward on diversity and political ideology at universities. You can also find the details on our website. And if you're working on your vacation plans, consider mixing public policy and cruising. Join PRI and the Claremont Institute for our joint 40th anniversary cruise on the Mediterranean. The cruise starts in Barcelona and ends in Rome with a special tour of the Vatican. Special guests include Andrew Roberts, author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, and will include our own Sally Pipes and Steve Hayward. For more details, visit ci-pri.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.